The day Rebecca Zimmerman's father lost everything at the poker table in Santa Rosa, California. She was standing in the general store counting pennies for flour when Sheriff Morton walked through the door with news that would change her life forever. It was the spring of 1878, and the California sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets as Rebecca felt her world tilt on its axis when the sheriff quietly informed her that her father had made a bargain with Kade Dalton, a rancher from the neighboring property, to settle his gambling debts. The arrangement was simple and brutal in its clarity. Rebecca would become Kade's wife, and her father's slate would be wiped clean. Rebecca dropped the coins she'd been clutching, the metallic sound echoing through the suddenly silent store as other customers turned to stare. Her fingers trembled as she bent to retrieve them, her mind racing through the implications of what she'd just heard. She barely knew Kade Dalton beyond seeing him occasionally in town, a tall figure in worn leather and dusty boots who kept mostly to himself. He was maybe 25 or 26, she guessed, with dark hair that touched his collar and eyes the color of storm clouds. She was 21, old enough to have expected proposals on her own terms, not as payment for her father's recklessness. "How much does he owe?" Rebecca heard herself asking, her voice steadier than she felt. Sheriff Morton shifted uncomfortably, his weathered face creasing with sympathy. $3,000, Miss Zimmerman. Your father got in deep with some men passing through. They weren't the forgiving type. Kade bought up the debt this morning. $3,000 might as well have been $3 million. Her father worked as a clerk when he could find the work, but mostly he drank and gambled away what little they had. Her mother had died 2 years ago from pneumonia, leaving Rebecca to manage a household that was barely more than a shack on the outskirts of town. She'd taken in sewing and laundry to keep them fed, but there was never enough left over to save. "And if I refuse?" Rebecca asked, though she already knew the answer. The sheriff's silence spoke volumes. The men her father owed weren't the type to simply shrug and walk away. They'd take it out of his hide and probably hers too. Rebecca gathered her pennies with shaking hands and walked out of the store without buying the flour. The afternoon sun was blinding as she made her way down the wooden boardwalk, her worn boots making hollow sounds against the planks. Santa Rosa was growing, with new buildings going up every month and more people arriving on the train from San Francisco. Progress was everywhere, it seemed, except in her own life. She found her father where she expected to, slumped in a chair outside the saloon, his face gray and sweating despite the shade. When he saw her approaching, something like shame flickered across his features before settling into the dull resignation that had become his constant expression. "Rebecca," he started, but she held up her hand. "Don't," she said quietly. "Just tell me if it's true." Her father nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "Kade Dalton's a good man. He has land, cattle, you'll be provided for." "I'll be sold," Rebecca corrected, her voice sharp despite the tears threatening to spill. "Like livestock. You don't understand how these men operate," her father said, and now there was fear in his voice. "They would have killed me, Rebecca, and they wouldn't have stopped with me." She wanted to scream at him, to rage against the unfairness of it all, but what good would it do? Her father had made his choices, and now she would pay the price. She turned away before he could see her cry and walked toward the edge of town, needing space to think. Kade Dalton's ranch was visible from the low hill beyond the last row of houses, a sprawling property with a sturdy barn and a house that looked well maintained. She'd heard he ran a successful operation, selling beef to the restaurants and hotels that catered to travelers passing through to San Francisco. He employed several ranch hands and was known for paying fair wages. By all accounts, he was exactly what her father had said, a good man. But Rebecca didn't want a good man chosen for her like a piece of merchandise. She wanted choice. She wanted freedom. She wanted love, though that seemed like a luxury far beyond her reach now. She sat on the hill until the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful if she'd been in any state to appreciate them. When the last light faded and stars began to appear, she finally made her way back to the shack she called home, steeling herself for whatever came next. Kade Dalton arrived at her door the following morning, and Rebecca's first thought was that he looked tired. His dark hair was freshly washed, and he'd clearly made an effort to clean up, but there were shadows under his gray eyes that spoke of a sleepless night. He held his hat in his hands, turning it slowly as he stood on the creaking porch. "Miss Zimmerman," he said, his voice deeper than she remembered, "I expect you've been told about the arrangement." "The arrangement," Rebecca repeated flatly. "Is that what we're calling it?" Something flickered in his expression, but he kept his composure. "May I come in?" "I'd like to speak with you properly." Rebecca considered refusing, but curiosity won out. She stepped aside, letting him enter the small, shabby room that served as both kitchen and living space. Their table was scarred and uneven, and the single window let in more draft than light. She saw him take it all in without comment, and she hated that she felt ashamed of her poverty. "I want you to know I didn't seek this out," Kade said once they were seated across from each other. "Your father's creditors approached me. They knew I had the means to settle the debt." "And you decided to buy yourself a wife." Rebecca kept her voice level, but anger simmered beneath the surface. "No," Kade said, and there was steel in his tone now. "I decided to keep you from getting hurt. Those men weren't bluffing about what they'd do. I've seen their work before." "How noble of you," Rebecca said. "And in exchange you get what? A housekeeper, a cook, someone to warm your bed." Kade's jaw tightened, and he set his hat on the table with deliberate care. "I get nothing," he said quietly. "The agreement your father made was that you'd marry me, yes. But I'm here to offer you a different arrangement." Rebecca blinked, thrown off balance. "What do you mean, marry me in name only?" Kade said. "Come to the ranch, let people think we're man and wife, but you'll have your own room, your own space. I won't touch you, won't make demands of you. After a year, if you want to leave, I'll give you enough money to start over anywhere you choose. You'll be free." The words hung in the air between them, and Rebecca found herself studying his face for signs of deception. But Kade met her gaze steadily, and she saw nothing but sincerity in those storm-gray eyes. "Why would you do that?" she asked. $3,000 is a fortune. Why spend it for nothing in return?" Kade was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was softer. "Because I know what it's like to have no choices, because you deserve better than to be bartered like property, and because I can afford to do the right thing, so I should." Rebecca felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of fear and anger beginning to unravel. This wasn't love, wasn't romance, but it was kindness. It was more than she'd had any right to expect. "1 year," she said slowly. "And then I'm free to go, no strings attached." "You have my word," Kade said. "We'll make it legal and proper. I'll have papers drawn up if you want them in writing." Rebecca thought about the alternative, staying in this shack with her father, waiting for the next disaster to strike. Or worse, running and looking over her shoulder for the rest of her life. At least this way, she'd have time to plan, to save, to figure out what came next. "All right," she said finally. "I'll marry you." They were wed 3 days later in a simple ceremony at the small church on the edge of Santa Rosa. Rebecca wore a dress she'd sewn herself from fabric that had been her mother's, pale blue cotton that brought out the green in her eyes. Kade wore a black suit that looked uncomfortable on his rancher's frame, and the preacher rushed through the words as if he had somewhere more important to be. Her father didn't attend, and Rebecca was grateful for that small mercy. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Kade didn't kiss her. He simply offered his arm, and they walked out of the church into the bright California afternoon as Mr. and Mrs. Dalton, bound by law but not by love. The ranch house was larger than Rebecca had expected, with solid wooden walls and real glass windows that let in generous amounts of light. Kade showed her through the rooms with an awkward formality, pointing out the kitchen, the parlor, his office where he kept the ranch accounts. Upstairs, there were 3 bedrooms. He'd given her the largest, with a bed that had a real feather mattress and a wardrobe for clothes she didn't own. "I'll be in the room at the end of the hall," Kade said, standing in the doorway. "If you need anything, just knock. Otherwise, the house is yours to do with as you please." "What about your ranch hands?" Rebecca asked. "Won't they think it strange that we're not sharing a room?" "What they think is their business," Kade said. "The house is private. They work the land and the cattle." They don't come inside unless invited. He left her then, and Rebecca sat on the edge of her new bed, feeling unmoored. Everything had changed so fast. 3 days ago, she'd been counting pennies in the general store. Now she was a married woman living in comfort she'd never known. But the walls felt like they were closing in, beautiful as they were, because she knew she was here out of obligation, not choice. That first week passed in a strange sort of dance. Kade rose before dawn and was often gone until dusk, working the ranch with his men. Rebecca explored the house, familiarized herself with the well-stocked pantry and the kitchen that had a proper stove. She cooked dinner each evening, not because Kade demanded it, but because it gave her something to do. They ate together in near silence, making stilted conversation about the weather or the ranch or nothing at all. At night, Rebecca lay in her comfortable bed and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the house settling, the distant lowing of cattle, the wind rustling through the oak trees that shaded the front porch. She thought about the year ahead, about what she might do with the freedom Kade had promised. Maybe she'd go to San Francisco, find work in one of the new department stores she'd heard about. Or maybe she'd head east, see the places her mother had told her about in stories. The second week, things shifted slightly. Rebecca was hanging laundry in the yard when one of the ranch hands, a grizzled man named Samuel, tipped his hat to her. "Good to see the boss finally settling down," he said with a gap-toothed smile. Place needed a woman's touch. Rebecca managed a smile in return, though the words stung. This wasn't real, she wanted to say. She wasn't really Kade's wife in any way that mattered, but she held her tongue and finished hanging the sheets. That evening, Kade came in with a split lip and bruised knuckles. Rebecca was pulling a roast from the oven when she saw him trying to clean up at the kitchen pump, wincing as the cold water hit his damaged skin. "What happened?" she asked, setting down the pan. "Nothing important," Kade said. "Just a disagreement with a horse that didn't want to be shod." "That must have been some horse," Rebecca said dryly. "Let me see." She approached him carefully, and Kade held out his hands with obvious reluctance. The knuckles were scraped raw, and she could see the beginnings of deep bruises forming. Without thinking, she went to the cupboard where she'd seen clean cloths and retrieved the small bottle of carbolic acid she'd noticed earlier. "This will sting," she warned, and Kade just nodded. As she cleaned his wounds, Rebecca found herself aware of how close they were standing, how solid Kade felt in the small space of the kitchen. He smelled of leather and hay and something else, something clean that might have been soap. His hands were large and calloused, the hands of a man who worked hard for his living. When she dabbed the carbolic acid on the worst of the scrapes, he didn't flinch, just watched her face with an intensity that made her nervous. "Why are you doing this?" Kade asked quietly. Rebecca didn't look up from her work. "Because you're hurt." "You don't owe me anything," he said. "That's not how this works." "I know," Rebecca said, "but maybe I want to anyway." She finished bandaging his hands and stepped back, suddenly self-conscious. Kade flexed his fingers experimentally, then met her eyes. "Thank you," he said, and there was something in his voice that made Rebecca's heart beat a little faster. They ate dinner together, and for the first time, the silence didn't feel quite so heavy. Kade told her about the horse, a wild Mustang one of his hands had caught and was trying to break. Rebecca found herself actually interested, asking questions about the process, about the ranch operations. Kade answered readily, and she realized he had a dry sense of humor that emerged when he relaxed. The weeks began to blur together, falling into a rhythm that felt almost comfortable. Rebecca tended the house and discovered she had a knack for baking bread, producing loaves that Kade praised with genuine appreciation. She started a small garden near the house, planting vegetables and herbs that would be useful in the kitchen. Kade built her a fence to keep the chickens out, working on it in the evenings after his regular work was done. They talked more during dinners, real conversations about their lives and histories. Rebecca learned that Kade had come to California 5 years ago from Texas, following the promise of land and opportunity. He'd worked as a ranch hand himself before saving enough to buy this property. He'd built the house with his own hands, along with help from the men who now worked for him. He'd never been married, never even been close. Why not? Rebecca asked one evening, emboldened by the ease that had developed between them. You must have had opportunities. Kade shrugged, carving another slice of the roast she'd prepared. Never felt right, I suppose. Never met anyone who made me think about forever. And now you're stuck with a wife you didn't choose, Rebecca said, trying to keep her tone light. Kade looked at her then, really looked at her, and Rebecca felt heat rise to her cheeks. I chose, he said quietly. Maybe not in the traditional way, but I made a choice, and I don't regret it. The words settled between them, heavy with meaning that Rebecca wasn't quite ready to examine. She changed the subject, asking about the new calves that had been born that week, and Kade let her redirect the conversation without comment. Summer came to Santa Rosa with blazing heat and cloudless skies. Rebecca discovered that the ranch had a small creek running through the back of the property, shaded by willow trees and just deep enough to wade in. On particularly hot afternoons, she'd escape to that spot with a book she'd found in Kade's small collection. Letting the cool water soothe her feet while she read one afternoon, she was so absorbed in her reading that she didn't hear Kade approach until his shadow fell across the page. She looked up, startled, to find him standing at the edge of the creek with his shirt sleeves rolled up and dust coating his skin. Sorry, he said. Didn't mean to scare you, I was just checking the water levels. It's fine, Rebecca said, closing her book. I should probably head back anyway and start dinner. But neither of them moved. The creek burbled peacefully and a bird sang somewhere in the willows. Kade looked like he wanted to say something, his brow furrowed in thought. Rebecca, he started, then stopped. Can I ask you something? Of course, she said, though her heart had begun to race. Are you happy here? Kade asked. I mean, I know this isn't what you wanted, but are you all right? The question caught Rebecca off guard with its sincerity. She thought about lying, about giving him the easy answer. But Kade deserved better than that. I'm more than all right, she said slowly. I won't pretend this is what I dreamed of, but you've been kind, you've kept your word, and I've found that I actually like it here. The ranch, the house, the work. It feels good to have purpose. Kade nodded, some tension leaving his shoulders. I'm glad. I know I'm not much for conversation, and the work keeps me away most days, but if there's anything you need, anything at all, you just have to ask. I know, Rebecca said softly. You've made that clear. Another pause, and then Kade did something unexpected. He sat down on the bank near where Rebecca had her feet in the water, close enough that she could have reached out and touched him if she'd wanted to. Tell me about your mother, he said. You mentioned she passed 2 years ago, but you've never really talked about her. So Rebecca told him. She talked about her mother's laugh, the way she'd sung while doing chores, how she'd made their poverty feel less desperate through sheer force of optimism. She told him about the pneumonia, how quick and brutal it had been, how helpless she'd felt watching her mother fade. She even told him things she hadn't spoken aloud to anyone, about how angry she'd been at her father for not getting the doctor sooner, for not having the money for proper medicine. Kade listened without interrupting, and when Rebecca finally fell silent, he reached out and took her hand. It was the first time he'd touched her beyond that initial handshake at their wedding, and Rebecca felt the contact like an electric shock. I'm sorry you went through that, Kade said. And I'm sorry about your father, about all of it. It's not your fault, Rebecca said, but she didn't pull her hand away. They sat like that until the sun began to set, hands linked, watching the water flow past and feeling something shift between them that neither of them was quite ready to name. As autumn approached, Rebecca realized with a start that she'd been at the ranch for nearly 4 months. The year they'd agreed upon suddenly felt both impossibly long and frighteningly short. She'd grown accustomed to this life, to the rhythms of the ranch, to Kade's quiet presence. The thought of leaving, of going to some unknown city to start over, had lost much of its appeal. She was kneading bread dough one morning when Kade came in earlier than usual, his face troubled. Rebecca looked up, her hands stilling in the dough. What's wrong? She asked. I have to go to San Francisco, Kade said. There's a buyer interested in purchasing a significant number of cattle, but he wants to meet in person to discuss terms. It'll take 3 or 4 days, maybe longer. All right, Rebecca said, puzzled by his obvious distress. That sounds like good business. I don't like leaving you alone, Kade said. Samuel and the other hands are good men, but still. Rebecca felt warmth spread through her chest at his concern. I'll be fine, Kade. I've been taking care of myself for years. I know, he said, but things are different now. You're my responsibility. Your responsibility, Rebecca repeated, and she couldn't keep a slight edge from her voice. Is that all I am? Cade's eyes widened, and he crossed the kitchen to stand in front of her, heedless of the flour dusting her apron. No, he said firmly. You're not just a responsibility, Rebecca. You're my wife, in name only, Rebecca said, echoing the words from their first real conversation. That's what we agreed. I know what we agreed, Kade said, and his voice had gone rough. But things change, feelings change, at least mine have. Rebecca's breath caught. What are you saying? Kade reached up as if to touch her face, then seemed to think better of it, his hand dropping back to his side. I'm saying that somewhere along the way, this stopped being an arrangement for me. I'm saying that I look forward to coming home because you're here. I'm saying that the thought of you leaving when the year is up makes me feel like someone's kicked me in the chest. Kade, Rebecca whispered, her heart hammering so hard she was sure he could hear it. I know I have no right, Kade continued. I know the deal was your freedom, and I'll keep my word on that, Rebecca. When the year is up, if you want to leave, I'll help you go, but I needed you to know the truth before I left for San Francisco. I needed you to know that I've fallen in love with you. The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest and terrifying. Rebecca's hands were trembling, leaving flour prints on her apron. She'd been so careful not to let herself feel too much, not to read meaning into kind gestures or lingering glances. But now that Kade had spoken the truth aloud, she couldn't deny her own heart any longer. I don't want to leave, she said quietly. I thought I did. I thought that's what freedom meant, but I was wrong. Kade went very still. What do you mean? I mean that freedom isn't running away to some strange city where I know no one, Rebecca said, the words coming faster now. Freedom is choosing to stay, and I choose you, Kade. I choose this life. I choose us. The smile that spread across Cade's face was like sunrise, bright and transforming. He stepped closer, and this time when he reached for her, Rebecca met him halfway. Their kiss was tentative at first, gentle, as if they were both afraid of breaking the fragile new thing between them. But then Cade's arms came around her waist, pulling her close, and Rebecca wrapped her flour-covered hands around his neck, and the kiss deepened into something that felt like coming home. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Kade rested his forehead against hers. I still have to go to San Francisco, he said, and Rebecca laughed. I know, she said, but you'll come back. I'll always come back, Kade promised, as long as you're here. He left the next morning, and Rebecca stood on the porch watching until his horse disappeared from view. The house felt empty without him, but it was a different kind of empty than before. Now it was anticipation, the sweet ache of missing someone you knew would return. Rebecca threw herself into work, keeping busy to make the time pass faster. She finished the garden fence that Kade had started, baked enough bread to feed the ranch hands for a week, and even started sewing curtains for the parlor from fabric she'd purchased during her last trip to town. Samuel and the other hands checked on her regularly, tipping their hats and asking if she needed anything, but mostly she was content with her own company. On the third evening, Rebecca was reading by lamplight when she heard horses approaching fast. Her first thought was that Kade had returned early, but the sound was wrong, too many horses moving too quickly. She set down her book and went to the window, her stomach tightening with unease. 3 men dismounted in the yard, and even in the dim light, Rebecca could tell they weren't friendly visitors. They moved with the swagger of men used to taking what they wanted, and when one of them kicked at the porch steps with unnecessary force, Rebecca knew she was in trouble. She grabbed the rifle that Kade kept by the door, checking that it was loaded as he'd shown her. Her hands were steady even though her heart was racing. When the knock came, hard and demanding, Rebecca positioned herself behind the door. "What do you want?" she called out. "We're looking for Thomas Zimmerman," a rough voice replied. "Heard his daughter lives here now." Rebecca's blood ran cold. Her father, even now his debts were finding ways to haunt her. My father's debts were settled, Rebecca said firmly. Kade Dalton paid them in full. Not these debts, the man said, and there was ugly laughter in his voice. Your daddy got himself into a new game last week, lost big, we've come to collect. He doesn't live here, Rebecca said. I can't help you. Oh, I think you can, the man said, and something heavy slammed against the door, making Rebecca jump back. One way or another, we're getting what we're owed. Rebecca raised the rifle, her finger on the trigger. I'm armed, she shouted. And I'll shoot anyone who tries to come through this door. There was a pause and then more laughter. Ain't that sweet? The little lady thinks she's going to hold off 3 grown men. Rebecca's mind raced. The ranch hands were in the bunkhouse on the far side of the property. Even if she screamed, they might not hear in time. She was alone, and these men clearly weren't going to be reasoned with. Another slam against the door, and this time Rebecca heard wood beginning to splinter. She backed toward the stairs, keeping the rifle trained on the entrance. If they got in, she'd make her stand from higher ground, but then she heard something else, hoofbeats coming fast and a voice she recognized shouting commands. Kade. He'd come back, the assault on the door stopped, and Rebecca heard the men in the yard cursing. She ran to the window in time to see Kade dismounting, and behind him, Samuel and 2 other ranch hands, all armed. Get off my property, Kade said, and his voice was cold enough to cut. This ain't your business, Dalton, one of the men said, though he'd already backed away from the porch. We're just collecting what's owed. My wife is my business, Kade said, and Thomas Zimmerman's debts died with the last payment I made. If he owes you money, you take it up with him, but you don't come to my home, you don't threaten my wife. And if I ever see you here again, I won't be asking questions before I start shooting. The 3 men exchanged glances, clearly calculating their odds. Whatever they saw in Kade's face and in the weapons held by his men convinced them to back down. They mounted their horses and rode off, throwing curses over their shoulders but not stopping. Kade watched until they were out of sight, then turned and ran for the house. Rebecca met him at the door, the rifle still in her shaking hands. He took it from her gently, setting it aside before pulling her into his arms. Are you all right? He demanded, his hands running over her as if checking for injuries. Did they hurt you? I'm fine, Rebecca said, though now that the danger had passed, she was starting to shake in earnest. They didn't get in, but Kade, my father, I know, Kade said grimly. I ran into him in San Francisco. He was drunk, bragging about his daughter who'd married well. I knew he'd cause trouble, so I cut my trip short and came back. Good thing I did. Rebecca pressed her face against his chest, breathing in his familiar scent. I'm sorry. This is all because of him, because of me. No, Kade said fiercely, tilting her chin up so she had to meet his eyes. This is because some men are cruel and your father is weak. None of it is your fault, Rebecca, none of it. Samuel cleared his throat from the doorway. Boss, you want us to keep watch tonight, just in case they come back. Yes, Kade said. Rotate shifts, and tomorrow I'm going to have a conversation with the sheriff about harassment. After the ranch hands dispersed, Kade led Rebecca to the kitchen and made her sit while he prepared tea. His movements were efficient but gentle, and Rebecca found herself watching him with new eyes. He dropped everything and raced back because he was worried about her. He'd faced down 3 armed men without hesitation. He'd called her his wife like he meant it with every fiber of his being. You came back early, she said softly. I came back because you're more important than any business deal, Kade said, setting a cup in front of her. I came back because the thought of you alone and in danger made me half crazy. I pushed that horse harder than I should have to get here. Rebecca reached out and took his hand. Thank you. Kade sank into the chair beside her, and Rebecca could see the exhaustion in his face now, the toll the hard ride had taken. I can't lose you, he said quietly. I just found you, Rebecca. I can't lose you. You won't, Rebecca promised. I'm not going anywhere. That night when Rebecca went upstairs, she didn't go to her room. Instead, she knocked softly on Kade's door. When he opened it, surprise clear on his face, Rebecca stepped close. I don't want to be alone tonight, she said simply. Kade's expression softened. He took her hand and drew her inside, and they lay down together on his bed, fully clothed, with Rebecca's head on his chest and his arms wrapped protectively around her. They talked in whispers until exhaustion claimed them both, falling asleep tangled together as dawn light began to creep through the windows. When Rebecca woke, she found Kade already awake, watching her with an expression so tender it made her throat tight. "Good morning," he said softly. "Good morning," Rebecca replied, and then, because she wanted to, she leaned up and kissed him. The kiss was slow and sweet, full of promise and new beginnings. When they finally broke apart, Kade smiled against her lips. "I could get used to waking up like this," he said. "Good," Rebecca said, "because I plan on making it a regular occurrence." Over the following weeks, their relationship deepened in ways that made Rebecca dizzy with happiness. They were truly husband and wife now in every sense, and the passion between them was matched only by the genuine friendship and partnership they'd built. Kade consulted her on ranch decisions, valuing her practical mind and good judgment. Rebecca found she had a head for numbers, and took over managing the account books, discovering several areas where they could save money and increase profit. They went to town together, and Rebecca noticed how Kade always kept her close, his hand at the small of her back or her arm tucked through his. People who'd known about the unusual circumstances of their marriage remarked on how happy they looked, and Rebecca couldn't deny it. She was happy, radiantly so. Her father, she learned through Sheriff Morton, had left Santa Rosa after Kade's warning, and the sheriff's pointed suggestion that his presence was no longer welcome. Rebecca felt a complicated swirl of emotions about that: relief, sadness, anger, but mostly she felt free. She'd spent so much of her life trying to fix her father's mistakes, trying to hold together a family that was already broken. Now she had a chance to build something new, something whole and healthy, with a man who truly valued her. Winter came gently to California, bringing cooler temperatures and occasional rain that turned the hills green. Rebecca and Kade spent long evenings by the fire, reading together or simply talking, content in each other's company. He taught her to play chess, and she taught him to dance, pushing the furniture aside in the parlor and humming melodies her mother had sung. One evening, as they swayed together in the firelight, Kade pulled back to look at her seriously. "The year is almost up," he said quietly. Rebecca's heart clenched. She'd been so happy she'd almost forgotten about their original agreement. "I know. I want to do this properly," Kade said. "I want to give you a real choice, not one made under pressure or obligation." He released her and took a step back, then, to Rebecca's shock, dropped to one knee. "Rebecca Zimmerman Dalton," he said, pulling a small box from his pocket. "I fell in love with your strength long before I fell in love with your smile. I fell in love with your courage, your kindness, your stubborn refusal to be diminished by circumstance. You make me want to be better, to build something lasting and good. Will you stay married to me, not because of any debt or obligation, but because you choose it? Because you choose us." Inside the box was a ring, a simple gold band with a small diamond that caught the firelight and sparkled. Rebecca's vision blurred with tears as she nodded. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, I choose us. I choose you, Kade, always." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood and kissed her with a passion that made her knees weak. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Rebecca laughed through her tears. "I never thought I'd be grateful for my father's gambling debts," she said, "but they brought me to you." "They brought us to each other," Kade corrected, "and I'll be grateful for that every day of my life." The following spring brought changes to the ranch. Kade purchased additional land from a neighbor looking to move back east, expanding their operations significantly. Rebecca discovered she was pregnant, a development that filled them both with joy and no small amount of terror. Kade became even more protective, if that was possible, hovering until Rebecca had to shoo him away so she could work. "I'm growing a baby, not dying," she told him with exasperation when he tried to carry her up the stairs for the third time in one day. "I know," Kade said, looking sheepish. "I just want to make sure you're all right." "I'm more than all right," Rebecca said, softening. She took his hand and placed it on her belly, where the baby had just started to show. "We're more than all right." Their son was born in the autumn of 1879, during a warm October evening with the midwife from town and Kade pacing anxiously downstairs. When Rebecca finally heard her baby's first cry, she wept with relief and joy. Kade burst into the room moments later, his face pale, and the midwife handed him the squalling bundle with a knowing smile. "A boy," she announced, "healthy and strong, just like his papa." Kade looked down at his son with an expression of such wonder that Rebecca felt her heart might burst. "He's perfect," he breathed. They named him James, after Cade's father, and the baby quickly became the center of their world. Kade proved to be a devoted father, getting up for midnight feedings and rocking James when he was fussy. Rebecca would wake sometimes to find her husband pacing the nursery in the dark, whispering stories to their son about the ranch and the horses, and all the things they'd do together when James was older. The years that followed were full and rich. The ranch prospered under their joint management, becoming one of the most successful operations in the county. They hired more hands, built a bigger barn, and added on to the house to accommodate their growing family. A daughter followed James, whom they named Clara after Rebecca's mother, and then another son they called William. Rebecca's father sent a letter once, asking for money. Rebecca showed it to Kade, and together they decided to send a small amount with a note that it would be the last. She never heard from him again, and while that hurt in some ways, Rebecca was at peace with it. She'd built her own family now, one based on love and respect and genuine partnership. On their 5th anniversary, Kade took Rebecca back to the creek where they'd had that pivotal conversation, the place where things had begun to shift between them. The willow trees were full and green, and the water babbled over smooth stones. They sat on the bank, older now, weathered by hard work and parenting, but happy in ways Rebecca had never imagined possible. "Do you ever think about how it started?" Kade asked, playing with Rebecca's fingers. "About how unlikely it all was?" "Sometimes," Rebecca admitted. "I think about that girl in the general store, counting pennies and feeling like her life was over. I wish I could tell her that it was actually just beginning." "I think about the choice I made," Kade said. "Buying that debt, offering you the arrangement. I told myself I was doing the right thing, the honorable thing, but I think part of me knew even then that you were special, that you were someone I wanted in my life." Rebecca leaned her head against his shoulder. "I'm glad you made that choice. I'm glad you saw past a transaction to the person I could be, the life we could have." "I see you," Kade said softly, turning to cup her face in his work-roughened hands. "I've always seen you, Rebecca, your strength, your heart, your beautiful soul. And I fall in love with you more every single day." They kissed there by the creek, with the same passion they'd had in the beginning but tempered now with years of partnership and shared experiences. When they returned to the house, their children ran to greet them. James chattering about the calf he'd helped Samuel feed, Clara showing off a flower she'd picked, and William reaching up to be held. That night after the children were asleep, Rebecca and Kade sat on their porch watching the stars emerge. The ranch spread out before them, a testament to their hard work and dedication. But more than that, it was home. Not because of the land or the house or even the success they'd built, but because they'd chosen it together. "I was promised in marriage to pay a debt," Rebecca said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. "But you gave me something far more valuable than freedom from obligation. You gave me the freedom to choose love." Kade pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "We gave each other that freedom, and I choose you every day for the rest of my life." As Rebecca settled against her husband's solid warmth, listening to the peaceful sounds of their ranch at night, she reflected on the strange and wonderful journey that had brought her here. She'd been sold like property, promised to a stranger to settle another man's mistakes. But that stranger had seen her worth, had honored not just their agreement but her essential humanity. And in doing so, he'd won her heart completely. The autumn of 1884 brought unexpected challenges when a drought threatened the region. Water became scarce, and many ranchers were forced to sell off portions of their herds at a loss. But Kade and Rebecca had planned for such eventualities, maintaining a careful reserve and making strategic decisions about which cattle to keep and which to sell. They made it through the difficult season with their operation intact, even managing to help some of their neighbors who weren't as fortunate. Rebecca had become something of a leader among the ranch wives in the area, organizing gatherings and mutual aid networks that helped everyone weather the hard times. She discovered a talent for bringing people together, for seeing solutions where others saw only problems. Kade often said she had more business sense than most of the men he dealt with, and he relied heavily on her counsel. Their children grew like weeds, James becoming a serious and thoughtful boy who loved working alongside his father, Clara proving to be as stubborn and independent as her mother, and William developing a sweet nature that charmed everyone he met. The house rang with laughter and the occasional argument, with bedtime stories and Sunday dinners that sometimes included the ranch hands who'd become like family. Samuel, the grizzled cowboy who'd been one of Kade's first employees, became a particular favorite of the children. He taught James to rope and ride, showed Clara how to whistle using a blade of grass, and carried William on his shoulders around the ranch. He never married himself, but he told Rebecca once that watching their family made him believe in the possibility of happiness. "You two started out all wrong, according to most folks' thinking," Samuel said one evening while helping Rebecca shell peas on the porch. "But you ended up more right than any couple I've ever seen. It gives an old bachelor like me hope." "It's never too late, Samuel," Rebecca said with a smile. "There's a nice widow in town who always asks about you." Samuel's weathered face actually flushed. "Mrs. Patterson, she's too fine a lady for the likes of me." "She's a woman who's known hardship and come through it strong," Rebecca said, "rather like someone else I know. You should ask her to the church social next month." To everyone's surprise, Samuel did exactly that, and within a year, he and Martha Patterson were married in a small ceremony at the ranch, with Rebecca and Kade standing up for them. It was another thread in the tapestry of community they were weaving, another example of how love could emerge in unexpected places. When James turned 10, Kade began teaching him in earnest about managing the ranch. Rebecca would watch from the kitchen window as father and son walked the property together, Kade pointing out various features and explaining decisions with the same patience he'd shown her years ago. James absorbed it all with quiet intensity, and Rebecca could already see the man he would become. Steady, thoughtful, kind like his father. Clara announced at age 8 that she intended to be a doctor, having been profoundly impressed by the physician who'd come from San Francisco to treat a ranch hand's broken leg. Instead of dismissing her ambition as most parents would have, Kade bought her medical texts and encouraged her curiosity. Rebecca taught her to read the complex terminology, and they discussed anatomy and treatment over dinner in a way that would have scandalized most of Santa Rosa society. "Let them be scandalized," Kade said when Rebecca mentioned this. "Our daughter is brilliant. Why should she be limited by what other people think girls ought to do?" Rebecca kissed him soundly for that, grateful every day that she'd been bound to a man who saw women as full people, not property or ornaments. The winter of 1886 brought unexpected news when a lawyer appeared at their door with documents regarding her father. Thomas Zimmerman had died in Oregon, the lawyer explained with professional sympathy, and had left his few possessions to Rebecca. "I don't want anything from him," was Rebecca's first reaction, but the lawyer explained that among her father's effects was a letter addressed to her. After he left, Rebecca stood in the parlor holding the envelope, her hands shaking slightly. Kade came to stand beside her, a solid, supportive presence. "You want me to read it first?" he offered quietly. Rebecca shook her head. "No, I need to do this." She opened the letter and read the shaky handwriting, her father's last words to her. He apologized for his failures, for the pain he'd caused, for the debt that had bound her to a stranger. But he also thanked her for surviving his mistakes, for building a life he'd never been strong enough to create. He told her that he'd heard about her family, her success, her happiness, and that knowing she was all right was the only good thing he'd done in his wasted life. Tears tracked down Rebecca's face as she read, not for the father she'd lost, she'd mourned that man long ago, but for the sad, broken person he'd always been. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and looked at Kade. He was sorry, she said simply. Does that change anything? Kade asked, not judgmentally, just curious. Rebecca thought about it. No, but it helps a little. He may have been weak, but he wasn't entirely heartless. He knew what he'd done to me, and he knew somehow that it turned out all right. More than all right, Kade corrected, pulling her into his arms. It turned out perfect. Rebecca laughed through her tears. I wouldn't say perfect. Remember when William got into the chicken coop and released all the hens, or when Clara decided to give herself a haircut? Kade added with a grin. Or when James tried to break that wild horse and ended up in the water trough. Rebecca continued. They stood there trading memories of domestic disasters and childish misadventures, and Rebecca felt the last weight of her father's legacy lift from her shoulders. He'd made terrible choices, but she'd made better ones. She'd chosen to stay, to love, to build something lasting and good. That was what mattered. The spring of 1888 marked a decade since Rebecca had become Kade's wife, and he insisted on celebrating properly. He arranged for the children to stay with Samuel and Martha for the evening, and took Rebecca into San Francisco for a night at a proper hotel, followed by dinner at her restaurant with white tablecloths and crystal glasses. Rebecca wore a new dress, deep green silk that Kade had commissioned from a dressmaker in town, and she felt elegant and beautiful as they walked into the restaurant arm in arm. Over a meal of dishes Rebecca had only read about in books, they talked about everything and nothing, enjoying the rare opportunity to be alone together. 10 years, Kade said, raising his glass. 10 years since I made the best decision of my life. The arrangement, you mean? Rebecca asked with a teasing smile, recognizing that you were extraordinary, Kade corrected. That you deserved better than the hand you'd been dealt, and that I wanted to be part of giving that to you. You gave me everything, Rebecca said softly, but more than that, you let me give to you. You let me be a partner, not just a dependent. You trusted me with your dreams and built mine alongside yours. They toasted to their partnership, their love, their future. Later, in their hotel room with the sounds of the city filtering through the windows, they made love with the passion of newlyweds and the deep knowing of long-married partners. Afterward, lying tangled together in sheets far finer than they usually slept in, Rebecca traced patterns on Kade's chest. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd said no? She asked quietly. If you'd refused to buy my father's debt. Kade was quiet for a moment, his hand stroking through her hair. I think I would have found you anyway, he said finally. Maybe not then, maybe not that way. But I believe we were meant to find each other, Rebecca. The circumstances just moved up the timeline. That's very romantic, Rebecca said, smiling against his skin. It's the truth, Kade insisted. You're the other half of my soul. I would have recognized you eventually, no matter how we met. Rebecca tilted her head up to kiss him. I love you, she said simply, more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. I love you too, Kade replied, always and forever. They returned to the ranch the next day to enthusiastic greetings from their children, who had apparently convinced Samuel and Martha to let them stay up far too late telling stories. The house felt more like home than ever after their brief absence, and Rebecca settled back into her routines with contentment. The years continued to pass in a blur of seasons and milestones. James grew into a tall, capable young man who managed significant portions of the ranch operations by age 18. Clara gained acceptance to a medical program in San Francisco, one of the few that would consider female students, and left home with her parents' fierce pride and support. William, sweet-natured and artistic, discovered a talent for breeding horses and began developing a line of exceptional quarter horses that drew buyers from across the state. Rebecca and Kade grew older together, their hair streaking with gray, their hands growing more weathered, but their love only deepening with time. They'd weathered droughts and floods, illness and injury, the normal trials of life and ranching. Through it all, they'd remained each other's anchor and support. One evening in 1896, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, Rebecca reflected on the nearly 2 decades since she'd stood in that general store counting pennies. She was 41 now, Kade 44, and they had built something remarkable together. "What are you thinking about?" Cade asked, noting her contemplative expression. "About how far we've come," Rebecca said. "About that frightened girl who thought her life was ending when it was really just beginning." "You were never just a frightened girl," Cade said. "You were fierce from the start. You just needed the chance to show it." "We made a good bargain, you and I," Rebecca said with a smile. "Even if it started out all wrong." "It started out exactly right," Cade disagreed. "It brought you to me. Everything else was just details." As if in agreement, the ranch spread out before them in peaceful beauty, testament to their years of hard work and dedication. But the real treasure wasn't the land or the success, or even the family they'd raised. It was the love they'd built, brick by brick, choice by choice, day by day. The turn of the century brought changes to Santa Rosa and to California as a whole. The railroad expanded, bringing more people and more progress. The rough edges of the Old West were smoothing out, becoming something more civilized and settled. But the Dalton Ranch remained a constant, a piece of living history where values like hard work, integrity, and genuine partnership still mattered most. Clara came home from her medical training with a husband, a fellow physician named David Marshall, who shared her passion for helping others. They established a practice in Santa Rosa, providing care to the growing community. James married a rancher's daughter from the next county, a practical woman named Sarah who fit seamlessly into the family. They built a house on the far section of the property and began raising children of their own, ensuring the ranch would continue for another generation. William, to everyone's surprise, fell in love with a traveling photographer who'd come through documenting the changing West. Her name was Lily Chen, daughter of Chinese immigrants who'd come to work on the railroad, and she captured the world through her camera lens with an artist's eye. Despite the prejudice they faced from some quarters, William and Lily married with the full blessing and support of the Dalton family. Cade made it clear that anyone who had a problem with his daughter-in-law would find themselves unwelcome on his property, and Rebecca loved him even more fiercely for his uncompromising stand. In 1903, Rebecca and Cade celebrated their 25th anniversary surrounded by children, grandchildren, and friends who'd become family. Samuel and Martha were there, both silver-haired now but still spry. The ranch hands, some of whom had worked for the Daltons for decades, raised glasses in toast after toast. The house overflowed with love and laughter, exactly as Rebecca had always dreamed it could be. That night, alone in the bedroom they'd shared for so many years, Cade presented Rebecca with a gift. It was a leather-bound journal filled with pages he'd written, documenting their life together from his perspective. Every major event, every small moment of joy, every challenge they'd overcome, he'd recorded it all. "I wanted you to know," Cade said as Rebecca paged through with tears streaming down her face. "I wanted you to see us through my eyes, how remarkable you are. How grateful I am for every single day we've had together." Rebecca set the journal aside and took her husband's face in her hands. "You saved me," she said fiercely. "You took what could have been a tragedy and turned it into the greatest love story I could have imagined." "We saved each other," Cade corrected. "I was just existing before you, Rebecca, going through the motions. You taught me what it meant to really live." They made love that night with the same passion they'd always shared, bodies familiar and beloved, hearts completely intertwined. And afterward, holding each other in the darkness, Rebecca thought about the girl she'd been and the woman she'd become. She'd been promised in marriage to pay a debt, bound to a stranger with no choice in the matter. But that stranger had honored not just the agreement, but her humanity. He'd given her freedom, and she'd freely chosen to give her heart in return. The years that followed were gentler, quieter. Rebecca and Cade stepped back from daily ranch operations, trusting James and William to handle most of the work. They traveled a bit, visiting Clara and her family, exploring parts of California they'd never seen. But they always returned to the ranch, to the home they'd built together. In 1910, as they approached their 32nd anniversary, Cade's health began to fail. A persistent cough that wouldn't go away, weight loss that alarmed Rebecca despite his assurances that he was fine. Clara examined him with professional concern and pulled Rebecca aside to deliver the news neither of them wanted to hear. There was something in his lungs, and it wasn't getting better. Rebecca refused to accept defeat. She cared for Kade with the same fierce determination she'd brought to every challenge in their life together. She made sure he took his medicine, prepared foods he could tolerate, sat with him through the long nights when breathing was difficult. Their children visited regularly, bringing grandchildren who climbed carefully onto Grandpa's bed to tell him stories and show him their treasures. On a warm spring evening in 1911, with the windows open and the scent of blooming flowers drifting in, Kade called Rebecca to sit beside him. His breathing was labored, but his eyes were clear and full of love. "I need you to know something," he said, his voice weak but determined. "You need to rest," Rebecca said, but he shook his head. "I need you to know that every single day with you was a gift," Kade said. "From that first moment when you stood in this house looking so scared but so brave to right now. You made my life meaningful, Rebecca. You made it beautiful." "Don't talk like you're saying goodbye," Rebecca said, tears streaming down her face. "We have more time. We have to have more time." "We had 33 years, Kade said, reaching up to wipe her tears with a trembling hand. "That's more than many people get in a lifetime. I'm grateful for every moment." He died 3 days later, peacefully in his sleep with Rebecca holding his hand. She felt the moment his spirit left, felt the profound silence that followed his last breath. And even through her crushing grief, she was grateful that she'd been there, that he hadn't been alone. The funeral brought what seemed like half the county. Kade Dalton had been respected and admired, a man of integrity who'd built something lasting and treated everyone fairly. But it was the personal stories that moved Rebecca most. The ranch hand he'd given a second chance after a stint in prison, the widow he'd helped with her mortgage when times were hard, the countless small kindnesses that had rippled outward over the years. In the weeks and months that followed, Rebecca struggled with grief and loneliness. The house felt too empty without Kade's presence, even surrounded by family. But slowly, she began to find her footing again. She had grandchildren to spoil, children who needed her wisdom and support, a ranch that still required attention. And she had her memories, precious and sustaining. She spent time writing her own journal, recording everything she could remember about their life together. She wanted the grandchildren to know the truth of how it started, to understand that love could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. She wrote about the arrangement, about Kade's honor and kindness, about how he'd given her freedom and she'd chosen to stay. She wrote about the building of their partnership, the raising of their family, the decades of daily choosing each other. Years passed, and Rebecca remained on the ranch, the matriarch of a sprawling family. James and Sarah took over full management of the operation, and it continued to prosper. Clara's medical practice thrived, and she began training the next generation of physicians. William's horses gained recognition across the West, and his marriage to Lily remained a beautiful example of love transcending prejudice. On quiet evenings, Rebecca would sit on the porch where she and Kade had spent so many hours together, watching the sunset and feeling his presence beside her. Sometimes she'd pull out the journal he'd written, rereading his words and remembering. The love they'd shared hadn't died with him. It lived on in their children, their grandchildren, the legacy they'd built together. In 1923, at the age of 68, Rebecca Dalton passed away peacefully in her sleep, in the house she and Kade had made a home. Her children found her that morning with a smile on her face and the journal Kade had written clutched to her chest. They buried her beside him under the oak trees that shaded the ranch, and on her headstone they inscribed the words she'd said so many times. She chose love, and love chose her back. The ranch remained in the family for generations, a testament to what Rebecca and Kade had built together. The story of how they met became family legend, told and retold to children and grandchildren. It was a story about honor and kindness, about seeing past circumstances to the person beneath, about building love through daily choices and unwavering partnership. But more than that, it was a story about freedom. Not the freedom of running away or avoiding commitment, but the freedom that comes from truly being seen and valued. Rebecca had been promised in marriage to pay a debt, bound by circumstances beyond her control. But Kade had honored not just their agreement, but her fundamental worth as a person. He'd given her the freedom to choose, and she'd chosen him. She'd chosen love. And in doing so, she'd found not just happiness, but a depth of partnership and joy that most people only dream of. The Dalton Ranch still stands today, over a century later, still family-owned and operated. The house has been expanded and modernized, but the original structure remains, carefully preserved. In the parlor hangs a photograph taken in 1900, showing Rebecca and Kade surrounded by their children and grandchildren. Their faces creased with age and weather, but glowing with unmistakable love and satisfaction. Visitors to the ranch sometimes ask about the couple in the photograph, and the current generation of Daltons tells their story with pride. It's a story that resonates across time because it speaks to fundamental truths about human dignity, about the power of kindness, about love that grows from respect and partnership rather than mere passion. Rebecca was promised in marriage to pay her father's debts. Kade honored the deal and her freedom. And together, they created something far more valuable than either of them could have achieved alone, a love that lasted a lifetime and a legacy that endures still.